pounds of thrust took off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Roughly 1 million people had gathered on the ground to watch this historic event, including half of the United States Congress. These 3 astronauts, as one of the newspapers put it at the time, carried with them the hopes of the world. The year was 1969, a year before I was born. The astronauts were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, and the mission was Apollo 11. Armstrong and Aldrin would go on to make history a little more than 100 hours later, when, with more than 1/3 of the Earth watching or listening live, they became the first humans to ever set foot on the moon. The Apollo 11 mission would go on to make history again, a little less than 100 hours after that, as the first mission not only to put men on the moon, but to bring them home safely as well. Although President Kennedy hadn't lived to see it, the bold goal that he had set 8 years earlier had been met. To steal a line from the flight director of that mission, we had shown that what America will dare, America will do. Today, we rightfully celebrate the momentous occasion that is the upcoming 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. As President Nixon said in a phone call to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin while they were still on the moon, because of what they had done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. Indeed, not only did we succeed in putting men on the moon and returning them safely to Earth, but we've gone on to put robotic rovers on distant planets, celestial observatories in orbit that can literally peer into the beginnings of the universe, and we've established a presence in low Earth orbit that is still there today. However, while it's tempting to focus only on the historic achievements that were Apollo 11, as some of our witnesses today will rightly highlight, the moon landing and the entire Apollo program for that matter, didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the result of visionary leadership, national unity, and old-fashioned American tenacity. The success of Apollo 11 and our national space program was also due in large part to the tireless contribution of countless women who were working behind the scenes and whose stories have only recently become household names. One of our witnesses today, Dr. Christine Darden, was one of the famed human computers at NASA. Without her work and the work of other computers, many of them African-American women, we never could have sent astronauts into space, let alone brought them home safely. Unfortunately, at the time, Dr. Darden and the other human computers' contributions were hidden, and they remained hidden for far too long, relegated to the background. After the movie Hidden Figures came out, a wonderful, wonderful movie that I commend to everyone, I introduced legislation to rename the street in front of the NASA headquarters as Hidden Figures Way. The D.C. City Council, in turn, took up the idea, and just a few weeks ago, I was proud to join Dr. Darden and the family of those other legendary human computers at the dedication of the new street sign in front of the NASA headquarters, so that now, a decade or a generation or a century from now, when a little girl or little boy goes to visit NASA, she or he will say, "Who were they? Tell me their story." As we look at the space landscape today, we see it's far different from the landscape of 1969. America and the Soviet Union are no longer the only players in space. Government space programs are no longer the only game in town. And our technological capabilities, both in terms of our ability to plan mission and how long these missions are, have changed dramatically. What do the next 50 years of space exploration look like? And what should we seek to accomplish? We need a bold vision, a vision that sees the commercial space industry thriving. I have long said that the first trillionaire, I believe, will be made in space. In 50 years, we will have gone back to the moon. Indeed, the United States will return to the moon as part of the Artemis program. Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo. And this time when we return to the moon, NASA has committed that we will land the first woman on the moon, an American astronaut. And on behalf of my two young daughters, let me say thank you, and it's about time. From there, we'll move towards having a more permanent and sustainable presence on the moon, and then ultimately to Mars. Just a couple of years ago, I was proud to author the bipartisan NASA Authorization Act, signed into law, in which every member of Congress in the House and Senate in both parties united to say the objective of space exploration for NASA is to go to the red planet and land on Mars, and that the first boot to set foot on the surface of Mars will be that of an American astronaut. The next 50 years have the potential to be even more consequential than the last. That's why I'm glad to be engaged with Ranking Member Sinema, with Chairman Wicker, with Ranking Member Cantwell on yet another NASA Authorization Act to help continue to lay out a bold, visionary agenda for NASA and manned space exploration so that America continues to lead the world in exploring space and exploring the great frontiers above us. With that, I recognize Senator Sinema.
Well, thank you, Chairman Cruz, for holding this hearing today. As we approach the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, it is timely to look back at our country's accomplishments in space. It's also important for us to look ahead at new strategies and technologies that will maintain United States leadership in space, grow our economy, and strengthen our country's security. Thank you, Dr. Dittmer, Mr. Hickman, Mr. Kranz, Mr. Stallmer, and Dr. Darden for joining us today. In 1961, when President Kennedy announced his ambitious goal for our country to send Americans to the moon, we did not anticipate the lasting impacts that mission would have on our nation. At the time, we didn't have the capabilities or know what was needed for mission success. Apollo 11 showed us what our country and NASA are capable of, demonstrated to the world that the United States is the leader in space, and charted the space exploration path we continue on today. The most impressive part is that we developed technologies and prepared for the mission on U.S. soil, and my home state of Arizona played a critical role. The data collected from the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, was used to make maps of the moon's surface before the mission. The Apollo astronauts also spent time in northern Arizona preparing for the mission. They hiked the Grand Canyon to learn about geology and visited Meteor Crater to get an up-close look at what they would encounter on the moon. During a test of the first-generation spacesuits at Sunset Crater, also in Arizona, NASA learned that the suits were not thick enough to withstand damage from rocks, forcing a redesign. The most significant training was done at Cinder Lake, just outside of Flagstaff. Scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey developed a 500-square-foot lunar environment, including 47 craters, to test wheeled rovers, hand tools, and scientific instruments. These efforts show what we can do as a country when faced with a challenge and the success achieving our goal brings. National and political support, robust funding, and innovation made President Kennedy's goal a reality on July 20th, 1969. As we enter the next phase of space exploration and return to the moon, we need to continue to utilize American expertise and ingenuity. And we need to work closely with our research universities, like the University of Arizona and Arizona State University, that provide leadership and do important work in these areas. And I'm looking forward to holding a hearing on university partnerships this year in this subcommittee. The United States has made significant technological advances since 1969, and we have a better idea of what is needed to explore space, but we still face many challenges. Our workforce is aging, and we have not sent humans to space on a NASA spacecraft in 8 years. We must evaluate the best use of taxpayer dollars to achieve our goals and maintain our leadership in space. Thank you again to all of our witnesses, and I very much look forward to your testimony today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd now like to introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Gene Kranz, who is a retired NASA flight director and fighter pilot. In 1994, after 37 years of legendary federal service, Mr. Kranz retired from NASA. After college, Mr. Kranz worked as a flight test engineer for McDonnell Aircraft, developing the Quail decoy missile for B-52 and B-47 aircraft. In 1960, Kranz joined the NASA Space Task Group at Langley, Virginia, and was assigned the position of Assistant Flight Director for Project Mercury. He assumed flight director duties for all Project Gemini missions and was branch chief for flight control operations. He was selected as division chief for flight control in 1968 and continues his duties as a flight director for the Apollo 11 lunar landing before taking over the leadership of the Apollo 13 Tiger team. He was discharged from the Air Force Reserves as a captain in 1972. Mr. Kranz has received many awards and honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which he received from President Nixon for the Apollo 13 mission, and his designation as a distinguished member of the Senior Executive Service by President Reagan. Mr. Kranz received a Bachelor of Science degree in Aeronautical Engineering from Parks College of St. Louis University. Our second witness is Dr. Christine Darden. It's good to see you again. Dr. Darden spent an esteemed 40 years at NASA, becoming one of the world's experts on sonic boom prediction, sonic boom minimization, and supersonic wing design. During her career, she was appointed as the technical leader of NASA's Sonic Boom Group of the Vehicle Integration Branch of the High Speed Research Program, where she was responsible for developing the Sonic Boom Research Program internally at NASA. In 1999, she was appointed as the director in the Program Management Office of the Aerospace Performing Center, where she was responsible for Langley research in air traffic management and other aeronautics programs managed at other NASA centers. Dr. Darden also served as a technical consultant on numerous government and private projects. She is the author of more than 50 publications in the field of high-lift wing design in supersonic flow, flap design, sonic boom prediction, and sonic boom minimization. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Mathematics Education from Hampton Institute, a Master's of Science degree in Applied Mathematics from Virginia State College, and a PhD in Mechanical Engineering from George Washington University. Our third witness is Dr. Mary Lynn Dittmar, who is the President and CEO of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. A 25-year veteran of the space industry, Dr. Dittmar assumed leadership of the Coalition in 2015. Prior to joining the Coalition from 2012 to 2014, she served as a member of the National Research Council Committee on Human Spaceflight. Prior to that, she acted as a special advisor to the NASA Astronaut Office before her appointment as Boeing Chief Scientist for Commercial Utilization of the ISS. Dr. Dittmar also coordinated R&D and managed flight operations for the Boeing Company on the International Space Station program. Dr. Dittmar is a Fellow of the National Research Society and an Associate Fellow of the American Institute for Astronautics and Aeronautics. Additionally, in June 2018, she was appointed to the unit's Users Advisory Group of the National Space Council. In October of that year, was appointed by the Secretary of the Department of Transportation to the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee for the FAA. Our fourth witness is Mr. Homer Hickam, who is best known for his memoir, Rocket Boys, about his West Virginia boyhood building model rockets. The book was subsequently made into the film October Sky. Mr. Hickam is a Vietnam veteran of the 4th Infantry Division and a 30-year careerist with the Army Missile Command and NASA, where he trained astronauts on such missions as Space Lab and the Hubble Space Telescope repair mission. He rounded out his career by negotiating with the Russians on how to train crews on the International Space Station. Besides his career as a writer, Mr. Hickam presently is the chairman of the board of the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Mr. Hickam received a Bachelor of Science degree in Industrial Engineering from Virginia Tech. And our final witness is Mr. Eric Stallmer, who is the president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, also known as CSF. CSF is the largest trade organization dedicated to promoting the development of commercial spaceflight, pursuing ever higher levels of safety and sharing best practices and expertise throughout the industry. Before working at CSF, Mr. Stallmer served as Vice President of Government Relations at Analytical Graphics, Inc., AGI. Mr. Stallmer joined AGI in 2002. While there, he oversaw all Washington operations and represented AGI's commercial, off-the-shelf products and technology to defense, intelligence, Congress, and civil government sectors within the aerospace industry. For more than 2 decades, Mr. Stallmer has also served as an officer in the United States Army and Army Reserves. He is currently assigned to the Pentagon in the Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff, Army for Logistics. Mr. Stallmer earns a Master of Arts degree in Public Administration from George Mason University and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and History from Mount St. Mary College. Welcome to each of you, and Mr. Kranz, you may begin. Could you turn your mic on, please?
I had a green button, but now it's red.
And I do,
Normally, green means go. Okay.
And I do have to say, I never imagined I would be giving you technical advice.
Okay. I'll start over. Okay. Chairman Kranz, Ranking Member Sinema, and members of the subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to discuss NASA's early and future human spaceflight programs. You know, this is an exciting time for me and for NASA and the space industry as we celebrate one of our nation's greatest technological achievements, landing 2 American astronauts on the moon and returning them safely to Earth on the Apollo 11 mission. I was fortunate to be a part of that team for that endeavor. Growing up, I could have never imagined I would serve in such a role. As a young boy, all I wanted to do was fly. On the path to becoming an aviator, however, I learned of resilience. I received an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy, but unfortunately, I failed the entrance physical, and I believe my dream was gone. I obtained a loan and attended Parks College of St. Louis University and earned a degree in aeronautical engineering, and I received an Air Force ROTC commission. After a tour in Korea as a fighter pilot, I selected reserve status and in 1958 was assigned as a civilian flight test engineer on the B-52 program. At the completion of the flight test program, I applied to NASA and was selected to join the Space Task Group at Langley in 1960. Beginning with John Glenn's Mercury mission, I served under Christopher Kraft as the assistant flight director. Having never met him before, our initial introduction was short and to the point. He tapped me in the shoulder, said, "I'm Chris Kraft, you work for me. I want you to go down to the Cape, write a countdown, write some mission rules. When you're ready, give me a call and we'll come down and launch." That was Redstone 1. I'd been 2 weeks in the job. As space missions became more challenging and the stakes higher, we grew into a stronger, more unified, and incredibly capable team. During this period, we developed a set of values. We called them the foundations, which guide our operations for the past 50 years and still apply to our work today. For the past several weeks, I've done dozens of interviews for local, national, and global media. And many reporters have questioned, should we go back to the moon? Should we go to Mars directly and skip the moon? Can we do it again? And why haven't we done it already? All good questions. Should we go back to the moon? The answer was simply yes, no questions. There are tremendous opportunities the lunar missions would provide our space industry in developing the new capabilities and technologies for spaceflight missions to the moon and then beyond. My answer, can we do it again, and why haven't we done it already, is much more complex. And that's really why I'm here today, to offer some perspective based on my experience as a leader of one of the spaceflight teams which accomplished President Kennedy's 1961 mandate to land an American on the moon and return him safely to Earth. The 1960s were not dissimilar to some extent where our nation is today. President Kennedy faced a confident Soviet Union and a sleeping giant in the People's Republic of China. We were at the beginning of the Vietnam War, and the domestic turmoil over civil rights was building. Kennedy's goal was timely and masterful, and utilizing the challenge of space exploration to unify our nation and demonstrate the technical capabilities of the United States. Today, we have many of the same issues. However, one critical, important element is still missing. Kennedy's mandate was the impetus, but there was a national unity that assured our success. I believe that today in our country, unity is necessary for great effort and is lacking within our country, our government, and within the space industry. We have an administration that is strongly supportive of space, that is willing to provide the resources. We have an agency chartered to do the mission, top-level leadership in place, and a very capable workforce. But each of the segments are philosophically divided on the goal. There is infinitely more technological capability than in the early programs, but there is a lack of focus and prioritization. I believe that the general support for space and a desire to see our nation continue and explore will continue. But without unity, the space exploration program will be grounded. To answer the question, what made Apollo a success? It was leadership, unity, and the team. The Mercury and the Gemini programs provided the knowledge, experience, and environment, and it developed the teams and the technologies and provided the training ground for time-critical, complex, high-risk leadership. The three elements of the Space Task Group were literally incredible. They created a unique organizational energy. We had classical aeronautical engineers from the Langley Research Center. We had a team of flight test personnel from Avro of Canada. And we had knowledgeable and energetic young recruits from America's colleges, resulting in a program-wide unity that was focused on a singular objective, space and the moon. As the programs evolved, we came face-to-face with various challenges and failures. We truly began to solidify our team's values. And our values were simple: discipline, competence, confidence, responsibility, and teamwork. And toughness entered our vocabulary, and it was learned the hard way after the Apollo 1 fire and the loss of the crew. Toughness meaning we are forever accountable for actions for what we do, or in the case of Apollo 1, what we failed to do. The leadership inherited from Langley and the Aero groups developed organizations with leadership at all segments in every level. There were individuals capable of taking leader-like actions to make their piece work. Leaders with confidence in their ability to send word back up the line that design, plans, and policies needed amendment or reversal. Our mission, one team and one voice, was present in every aspect of our work, from the formation of the Space Task Group through subsequent programs. The three primary elements, however, that contributed to the success of the Apollo program are well documented as NASA's special publication 287. There are spacecraft hardware that is the most reliable, flight missions extremely well planned and executed, and flight crews superbly trained and skilled. The key area considered most pertinent, however, to system design is related to safety. NASA has 6 decades of experience in manned spaceflight and has written numerous papers related to design criteria, materials, fault tolerance, propellants testing, and many other space system design. From the start of Gemini and for subsequent programs, the NASA astronauts, safety engineers, design engineers, and my personnel were embedded in the space system design and change control process from the very beginning of program initiation. This assured timely inputs to the system design, testing, and development of the flight procedures and rules and the plans, and the correct configuration of the mission facilities and trainers. It is essential in today's current programs that NASA has the insight necessary to ensure safe and successful design, test, and operations. With the emphasis on concurrent engineering and reinventing NASA, we must assure that individual responsibility is not forever lost. For all of NASA's programs, we must have individuals accountable for design, development, and operations. While the world has changed dramatically since Apollo and in the space program since my retirement, the constant essentials for success are unchanged: leadership, unity, and teamwork. And I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kranz. Dr. Darden.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Senate Commerce Committee, and members of the Subcommittee on Aviation and Space, I am very honored to be present today to participate in your committee hearings. I am here as a child of the space race. On October the 5th, 1957, I vividly recall the headline about Sputnik as I took the newspaper into my high school library. I also vividly remember May 1961, when my dormitory halls were filled with screams about the challenge that President John Kennedy had just issued about landing a man on the moon and safely bringing him back before the end of the decade. Where have we been? It is the response to that challenge with Apollo that makes NASA and all of us so very proud. At that time, NASA Langley Research Center had existed as the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA laboratory, for 40 years, and had spent countless hours thinking about how to leverage our aeronautics expertise to address the challenges of spaceflight. NASA Langley had begun Project Mercury and trained its 7 Mercury astronauts to fly in space. As preparation for Apollo, the Gemini program focused on rendezvous, docking, and long-term spaceflight. The Apollo program captured the world's attention and demonstrated the power of America's vision and technology to inspire great achievements. On July 16, 1969, though it was the NASA Space Centers that were visible to the public as the Saturn V set poised for liftoff, many workers from the research centers, like Langley, were several years removed from the simulators that they built for training the astronauts, from the wind tunnel tests that they did, which is where I worked. Those tests validated the spacecraft configuration and determined the re-entry safety. But Apollo was in their hearts, and Apollo was supported by this country. After 11.5 years, Apollo ended, having spent a record $23.5 billion, having placed on the moon and safely returned 12 men, and having inspired thousands of young engineers and space enthusiasts like myself. Sadly, after Apollo ended, there was a decline in the number of American students getting higher degrees in the STEM areas. Where do we go from here? NASA is now poised to return American astronauts to the lunar surface by 2024 as part of our broader Moon to Mars exploration. Artemis is the program to prove technologies, capabilities, and new business approaches for future missions to Mars. Through Artemis, NASA will establish a sustainable human presence on the moon by 2028. Inspiring the Artemis generation. Certainly one of the necessary needs as we go forward is the development and preparation of a strong, energetic, and committed workforce as that we had for Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. A thriving, visible Artemis program will do much to inspire the next generation and to pursue STEM careers, just as I was inspired as I saw the work being done at NASA result in Neil Armstrong walking on and safely returning from the moon. After Apollo, I spent 25 years working in supersonic aerodynamics and minimizing the sonic boom. When I retired from NASA, 2 young ladies came to my party and stated that it was because of my sharing my story of how I got to NASA and what I did at NASA that inspired them to become engineers at NASA. I have, over the past 2 years, spoken to thousands of students about following their dream, about preparing themselves and persevering. hoping that they too will be inspired to join the likes of an Apollo generation to push the boundaries of knowledge. They will pursue groundbreaking research to understand how to live and work on another planet. Since retiring from NASA, I have remained an advocate for the agency and our work in aeronautics and exploration. I wish to thank the committee members for your continued support of NASA and for the important work you are doing to pass NASA's authorization bill this Congress. NASA really needs an authorization bill that supports our nation's plans for the Artemis program and the overall approach for Moon and Mars. In summary, this lunar destination is promoting sustainability, a proving ground for Mars, a strategic presence for our nation, and a foundation for building international and commercial partnerships, while also inspiring the next generation to be prepared for the excitement and groundbreaking new opportunities. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Darden. Dr. Dittmer.
Chairman Kranz, Ranking Member Sinema, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today with such an extraordinary and distinguished panel to discuss my thoughts on the topic of today's hearing. More than 50 years ago, the Apollo program began, ultimately resulting in one of humankind's most extraordinary achievements. Mission readiness was the driving force of the entire effort. To achieve the mission, certain capabilities had to be developed. These included standing up a human spaceflight organization capable of developing and delivering a super heavy lift vehicle, a crew capsule, ground systems, EVA suits, crew systems, silence payloads, and related equipment. An entire operations concept and an organization called Mission Control had to be invented. I will defer here to Mr. Kranz. The overarching goal, however, was the geopolitical one. The Apollo program was the means to achieve it. Involving over 400,000 Americans and at the cost of $300 billion in adjusted dollars for the entire program, President Kennedy's challenge was fulfilled between July 16th and 24th, 1969, with a lunar landing on July 20th, 50 years ago. With regard to today's goals, the primary objective of NASA's human spaceflight program, viewed through a national lens, remains a geopolitical one, although it is a different geopolitical objective. No longer in a race to the moon with the Soviets, the United States leadership in space depends upon creating a foundation that provides other nations and a nascent space-based economy with security and assurance regarding our national intentions and long-term commitment to aspire, inspire, and achieve. In short, to lead human space exploration and the development of space. If we do not do this, rest assured that someone else will. Space remains a strategic competitive domain between nations. Accordingly, the United States is developing core capabilities to enable our return to deep space: a super heavy launch vehicle, a modern crew vehicle capable of long-duration missions when paired with habitats and consumables, and ground-based infrastructure needed to support those missions. Dubbed the Space Launch System, the Orion Crew Vehicle, and Exploration Ground Systems, respectively, these strategic assets are the foundation upon which national goals in human deep space exploration will rest for the foreseeable future. Similar to the development of military capabilities, these are long lead time national assets, sustained as a guarantee against economic downturn, policy shifts, and as a message to the global community. In addition, NASA's Artemis program will engage industry and international partners, seeking to align national objectives with those of commercial enterprises and global collaborators in the human exploration of deep space. The momentum established by the current administration with its focus on the moon is a welcome one. But as report after report has shown, NASA is asked to do too much with too little, and this is no exception. Acceleration must be balanced with management of program risk, mission assurance, and safety. Forward momentum also must be matched by significant national investment above present levels. The administration has proposed $1.6 billion to begin the process of accelerating our human space exploration program. In addition, the NASA administrator has estimated it will take between $4 to $6 billion per year over currently anticipated funding levels to meet more aggressive timelines. While funding increases are always a political challenge, it is worth noting that the benefits of 10 times that amount in adjusted dollars invested in the Apollo program are evident to all, and formed the foundation both for today's national effort and for the growing entrepreneurial sector. A personal aside, I actually have been on crutches for the last 2.5 years as a result of a connective tissue disorder. And during the launch and landing of Apollo 11, I was at home after having just gone through my 4th surgery. I now stand before you without crutches in due of 2 years of work in physical therapy using technology that was developed in the space program. So for me, this is deeply personal. NASA plans to achieve architectural flexibility at the moon by constructing a lunar orbital station known as the Gateway in partnership with industry and international partners. Among other things, Gateway simplifies our ability to aggregate hardware in the vicinity of the moon, including descent and ascent vehicles for transportation of humans back and forth to the lunar surface. Longer surface missions enabled by Gateway make it easier to conduct lunar operations over time. Entrepreneurial firms are teaming with investors and also established companies to develop technologies aimed at building up infrastructure on the moon. With regard to science, the moon has been called the Rosetta Stone of the solar system, with evidence locked within it that has already taught us a great deal about the formation of the Earth-Moon system. We've explored only 5% of the surface. There's a great deal more to learn. Finally, Gateway is the next logical step in developing a command and logistics capability that is extensible, not just to the moon, but beyond the moon toward Mars. The Gateway itself is a prototype, an evolution of lessons learned over the last 50 years, and in particular from the International Space Station, to create habitable space and systems to support human life and work in deep space. The moon is an important stepping stone. What we learn there will not only create opportunities in cislunar space, but will open new discoveries and knowledge that would help us as we look toward Mars. But the moon is not an end goal, it's a beginning, a next step enabling the migration of technology, heavy industry, and humanity itself off the Earth and into the solar system at a scale that is no longer constrained by a single planet, our original home. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Detmer. Mr. Hickam.
Good afternoon, Chairman Kranz, Ranking Member of Sinema, and members of the subcommittee, with a special shout out to Senator Capito from my home state of West Virginia, who's probably thinking to herself, oh my gosh, what's Homer going to say now? What Homer is going to say now is that I believe most firmly that our destiny lies at the moon. We need to go back to the moon, we need to put an anchor there, and from that anchor, develop the moon commercially and scientifically. One of the stories left out of the movie October Sky that was based on Rocket Boys was the fact that I met Senator John F. Kennedy when he was running for president in the West Virginia primary that he had to win. And since I was a rocket boy headed toward the National Science Fair, he asked me what we should do in space. And I answered Senator Kennedy. I looked around at all the coal miners in the crowd, and I said, well, I think we should go to the moon and just mine the blame thing. And all the coal miners, they laughed and cheered, and he said, elect me president, and maybe we will. Most recently, one of my books called Back to the Moon, Vice President Pence told me that that's one of his favorite books. And we talked at length and extensively about that. The next thing I knew, he was down in Huntsville, Alabama at the Space and Rocket Center at Space Camp saying we're going back to the moon by 2024. So I'm kind of in a unique position of being able to take credit for both the Apollo and the Artemis space program. I really do advocate going back to the moon. There is a lot of work to do there. There is decades of work yet to be done. Where was I when Apollo 11 landed? I was in the hospital ward at Fort Lewis, Washington, with some fellow veterans of the 4th Infantry Division, and we watched the Apollo land. And at that point, even though my mind had been occupied a great deal by Vietnam and all of that struggle, I realized that I really wanted to work for NASA. I was going to make that happen. It took me a while. In 1981, when the shuttle started to fly, I got to work for NASA, and I loved it. I woke up every morning and said to myself, oh my goodness, this is great. I get to go work for NASA today. It's a tremendous agency, and I absolutely loved it. Well, here we are, and what are we going to do? Well, Mark Twain once said, God looks after fools, drunks, and the United States of America. And that comment was never more apt than the way our space program has evolved. Modern American industry is now moving forward in space in astonishing ways. And just SpaceX and Blue Origin are just a couple of those bright new companies that are coming up. They're able to come up with new designs and be more timely and create much less expensive ways to get in space. They're even beating out the heavily subsidized space programs around the world, like China. So we have every right to be proud of that. And why are they able to do that? Because of a number of parallel forces that include modern computer systems, the rise of the internet, new manufacturing techniques, and along other parallel lines, we see a demand for clean and abundant energy, and awareness that Earth is in danger of being permanently polluted, and the gradual development of a new philosophy that seeks to put mankind in context with the universe. As all engineers know, parallel lines never intersect until they do. These parallel lines of force I just mentioned intersect primarily at one place, our moon. Luna, the small planet that circles us, our 8th continent torn from the Earth millennia ago. And so it is at this moment, given to us by the benevolent hand of creation, that all the elements needed to go back to the moon and set up shop have come to us so as to utilize its mineral wealth and discover all that is there. And this includes, by the way, the possibility of evidence of life. We've never looked at a single water molecule from space. We're going to find a lot of water ice on the moon, and in there might be evidence of life, because the Earth and Luna have been sharing DNA for millions of years because of meteors and asteroids. Sort of God's little space program. Didn't work out for the dinosaurs, but it may work out for us. In summary, I applaud the essentials of the Artemis program to take us to the moon, but I do say so with this proviso, that what we do on Luna must make sense to the American people, both economically and philosophically, and should be designed in such a way that it may cost the people's money to place an anchor there, but not so forever in order to sustain our presence. The riches on the moon, rare earth metals, thorium, titanium, helium-3, and other minerals should be gathered to boost our economy and thus put money in the pockets of all Americans. Our citizens should be assured that a base on the moon will make this country stronger and safer. And I have to say, I don't really much care who the next professional astronaut on the moon is. What I care about, who the next American plumber, electrician, construction worker, and blue-collar worker on the moon, because when that happens, we know that we are finally a space-faring nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hickam. And when you invoked the Twain quote about fools and drunks, I assume most people at home just assumed you were talking about the United States Congress.
No, sir.
Mr. Stallmer.
I have a tough act to follow. Homer was there to inspire the Apollo program. I wasn't even born for Apollo 11, so you raised the bar quite a bit. Chairman Kranz, Ranking Member Sinema, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for inviting the Commercial Spaceflight Federation today to discuss how rapid advances by U.S. commercial space industry can help NASA truly honor the Apollo legacy by leading humanity into the solar system further and faster. In the past 2 years, NASA has crystallized an ambitious agenda to commercialize low Earth orbit, establish a long-term presence on the surface of the moon, and send humans to Mars. These goals are all linked together, and collectively, they will enable an expansion of our civilization in the solar system. It is the breadth of this vision of space as a frontier for all that makes the recent emergence of a strong U.S. commercial spaceflight industry so uniquely valuable. It didn't just happen overnight. For 2 decades, NASA has fostered the development and increasing success of this industry, sharing technologies and expertise, co-investing in private innovation, and using its purchasing power to serve as an initial customer. Those steps have enabled private companies to develop, own, and operate their own human spaceflight hardware to serve the public needs as well as the private sector markets. These efforts were established in NASA's mandate to seek and encourage to the maximum extent possible the fullest commercial use of space, as well as the bipartisan legislation and administrative policies under both Democratic and Republican presidents. Over just the past 2 years, Space Policy Directives 1, 2, and 3 have strengthened this partnership between government and industry and helped remove barriers to industry growth. And under your leadership, this committee has worked to facilitate industry's development via the Space Frontier Act. We thank you. At the start of the space age, the United States established its leadership in space with government-funded and led exploration projects. When President Kennedy proposed sending an American to the moon, there were no alternatives to the all-government strategy. But today, 5 decades after Apollo, the United States is enjoying a renaissance in space, with commercial space enterprises playing a leading role. The details are in my written testimony, but in summary, the U.S. has leapt forward in 2018 in every commercial space sector, with more launches, more spacecraft pursuing both old and new space applications, benefiting more and more stakeholders here on Earth. So today, as we seek to further develop low Earth orbit, place an enduring American presence on the moon, and send not just 2, but many brave pioneers to Mars, policymakers like yourself have newer, more affordable, and sustainable options than just repeating Apollo. The ingredients of a successful strategy have proven themselves over and over in recent years. Future LEO infrastructure, every operational element of returning to the moon, and most of any affordable Mars architecture should be purchased commercially or developed via a COTS-like partnership. For example, allowing the private sector to develop its own solution for the Lunar Gateway power propulsion element, NASA was able to generate a fixed-price bid that was more than $200 million less than the closest competitor. While science is appropriately a government-led activity, the basic engineering and infrastructure that supports it can be provided commercially, with only the leading-edge tools and instruments required by government stewardship. NASA should specify clear, high-level outcome-based requirements and allow entrepreneurs to innovate and create affordable and basic capabilities to meet essentially all of the operational needs. And NASA must pay for results, not effort, on all developmental programs, but the most esoteric technical challenges. Whenever possible, NASA should award multiple competitively chosen funded Space Act agreements to commercial partners willing to put up private capital at their own risk. That leverage, plus ongoing competition, will replace any need for the costly micromanagement and bureaucracy of typical FAR-based contracts. Competition also allows for greater diversity in technical approaches and much lower strategic program risks. None of this will be easy. Commercializing low Earth orbit will be hard. Human travel to the moon is hard. And staying there will be even harder. Mars will be harder still, but with an even greater rewards as we explore a different planet and its moons. But American industry is ready to help NASA chart an affordable and sustainable path into this challenging future. This month, it's natural to venerate the past, but we should also be proud of the great new things we are achieving today and what we can do together tomorrow if we build a true partnership between government, including Congress, and the American people and their enterprises. Chairman Kranz, Ranking Member Sinema, thank you for your invitation and attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stallmer. Thank you to each of the witnesses for your testimony today. As we sit here today reflecting back on the last 50 years and the journey that America has traveled and that space exploration has traveled since that giant leap for mankind, I think it is also appropriate for us not just to look backwards, but to look forwards and to ask, what do the next 50 years hold? In the year 2069, perhaps our kids or grandkids will be participating in another hearing marking the 100-year anniversary of man landing on the moon. And so my first question I want to ask the panel is, in the next 50 years, what should we hope to accomplish in space? What should our objectives be? What should we be looking forward to?
I think what's paramount is that over the last 50 years, we could have and should have done a lot more. As young people that looked at the Apollo era 50 years ago and said, gosh, we landed a man on the moon in 1985, what are we going to do? And 20 years later, what could we be doing? And what have we done? We haven't really returned back to the moon, humans. And I think we really need to accelerate and not think as much the next 50 years, but maybe the next 20 years, what we can do. And I think we have all the ingredients to do it properly. I think this reinvigorated look to the moon, to the exploration, to setting up a base on the moon, what Gateway will provide, and that outlooking future vision for what we can do on Mars. I don't think we should focus so far on 50 years, but I think in the next 25 years, when a lot of these young people in this room behind me are coming of age, and these engineers, that they will have that opportunity to live and work in space and develop the new businesses that are going to help promote, make the space and the global space market right now is a $360 billion industry. I agree with you that it's going to be a $1 trillion industry probably within a decade. And we have to look at what are those commercial opportunities that are going to be available in space. And that's what excites me.
I think from my standpoint there, we had an excellent plan that was written by Tom Paine. It was probably the most widely distributed plan with participation from industry, commerce, academia, right on down the line. It was called Pioneering the Space Frontier. And I think the key thing that we have to do is establish a plan and stick with it. Since then, there have been at least 3 other plans. It was interesting. In that Pioneering the Space Frontier, the Gateway was discussed, but it never showed up in any of the subsequent plans. So the question is that there's good work out there. What we have to do, I think really this administration should do to fit into the Artemis plans here, is to really take a look at those plans that have been written and see what parts still are viable, what parts fit together. Because you're talking about a direction well beyond the moon. You're talking about a direction for the future. And this plan was really, the Pioneering the Space Frontier was a 50-year plan, I believe. So I think it's worthwhile to address.
Mr. Kranz, in your testimony, you stated that you don't see the same national unity that we saw in the 1960s that led to the successful Apollo program. Can you elaborate on that and what we need to do to achieve that unity once again? I
could talk for hours on this. I've finished writing a book. I don't know if that'll get published because I've addressed my perspective of the agency and our work in space since the time I joined back in '60 through actually the first 4 decades. It was very influential from my standpoint. I was doing try to figure out why I was director of mission operations for a while and why we got such confusing change of plans, directions right on down the line. Aaron Cohen, in the oral history, described the period after Challenger as a time worse than chaos. He was one of the center directors. He'd been up at headquarters. That was part of his oral history. Dick Turley did the same thing. He talked about rough seas, study the course. So it's really a question that I go back into the leadership focus that we need within the agency, but it starts at the very top and says, this is what we're going to do. What I want you to do is give me a set of plans to accomplish that objective. I'll work with you to pick the people, but we need to find leadership. We ought to go to the government. You know, when I was growing up in space, we had very competitive industries, highly incredible aircraft and aerospace industry in there. And we were able to get people from McDonnell Aircraft, John Yardley, to come down and show us how to start a program and get it started. He was teaching us the business of program management. Dale Myers came in the same thing. I hated the Myers, Malkin telecons, but they were places where we learned the business from the professionals of the business. So I think the key thing is the future is there. A lot of the plans are there. We have to establish which plan we're going to subscribe to and get on with it, and then find the leaders to implement it.
So final question. In your judgment, what are the benefits to Americans of returning to the moon and establishing a sustainable habitat on the moon? Mr. Hickam, you addressed this already.
Yes. You know, I was raised in a little town of Colwood, West Virginia. And in places like Colwood, bituminous coal was brought up in the early 20th century that basically fueled the American economy and really the civilization of this country. So what would I like to see in 50 years? I'd like to see Colwood on the moon. I'd like to see families raised on the moon. I'd like to see blue-collar workers, miners, getting money in their pockets and essentially creating a space-based economy, because I agree with you. Next trillionaire is going to be from space. The place to go make that happen is the moon. And how can we make that happen? When Mr. Carter, who built Colwood, first went in there, he went out on the back of a mule. But that mule went along, first he got off the railroad, took the mule and him on the railroad to a certain station, then got off of that on a road that was built that took him into Colwood, and there he sunk the shaft and brought up about 1 million tons of coal. Then it's the government's responsibility, in my opinion, to do very much the same on the moon. We need to put an anchor on the moon, a place where people can go, companies can go, countries can go, and from there they can branch out and develop coal woods on the moon and basically cause a real space economy to develop.
Well, and I'm looking forward to seeing the spacesuit that we can fit a mule into.
Me too.
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for your testimony. My first question is for Dr. Darden and Mr. Kranz. Both of you worked at NASA leading up to and during the Apollo missions and can offer a unique perspective on how NASA achieved its ambitious goal in the 1960s. What lessons do you believe NASA's current leadership and workforce can learn from your experiences at NASA during the Apollo missions as we prepare to return to the moon?
Well, when I went to NASA, they were 2 years away from walking on the moon. I went in 1967, but I think his comments about the leadership, the commitment, and the background that they had in working with the other programs, Project Mercury and Gemini, I think all of those were factors of how these persons pulled together and were committed to making that a successful program, a successful project.
From my point, I think that there was the mutual sharing of knowledge. When I first got in, NASA told you I had to write the countdown. I didn't know anything about rockets, space, Mercury, spacecraft, et cetera. But I could walk around Hangar S where the spacecraft. I could go down to the blockhouse, talk to the booster people. I could go over to the range safety people. So it was a question. There was so much to do and so much to learn that literally everybody spent the entire day telling everybody what they learned, and it was vice versa. So I think we have to reestablish this passion, the energy, the imagination in our organizations. And I think this starts right at the top in leadership. I think somewhere along the line, our leadership values have sort of been subtly changed. It might be generational to a great extent. I think the generation I came from, I call it the Apollo generation, the sons and daughters of the greatest generation. I think they had what I'd say, grown up, born in the Depression. I think that we have to sort of like reconstitute what our nation is and what it stands for and what we expect from our people. What are the expectations we have for all employees in NASA, federal government, right on down the line? In mission control after the Apollo 1 fire, which was disastrous, many of us lived through that 18 seconds, but we sat down after we finished and wrote out the searing impressions we had in such a fashion that we would never go through this again. We call it the Foundation's mission control. It's really, in fact, it's on the internet, and I get requests for this every day, but I'm surprised going to Fortune 500 companies and see it in the wall. I see the Kranz dictum where I was angry, passionate, accept responsibility. For the Apollo 1 fire, the crew could have called it off. I could have called it off. The touch conductors could have called it off. But nobody said, stop it's not right. So it's a question we have to redefine expectations that we have for ourselves, our organizations, our people, and our leadership. And I think it's there. What we got to do is put it in words. We need to establish some shared values that we're all working to.
Thank you. GAO's 2018 assessment of major projects at NASA pointed out that more than half of NASA's workforce is over the age of 50, and 21% of NASA's workforce is already eligible for retirement. Workforce challenges exist beyond NASA. Since the shuttle program ended in 2011, many of the commercial manufacturers and suppliers who had for decades supported NASA missions were left to close up shop, and many of the skilled employees who worked to support NASA programs went and found work elsewhere. So my next question is for Dr. Dittman and Mr. Stallmer. As the United States prepares again to send Americans into space and return to the moon, do you believe the current workforce at NASA and its commercial partners is sufficient to support a long-term series of American space leadership?
So in my written testimony, I did address this to some extent, but let me just sort of recap briefly. There have been several studies recently that have looked at when people first become interested in going into aerospace, and about 71% of them become interested while they're in grade school. The pressure that you're describing with regard to people continuing to work, stay in the workforce longer, does make it difficult for younger people to enter. At the same time, however, there are terrestrially based activities, IT, computing, advanced artificial intelligence, a number of those. And those high-tech firms, they actually have been attracting for some time some of the best and brightest in the country. So the situation that we're facing is we have an aging workforce. We do have positions opening up, but a lot of those positions are being competed for by other industries that are very attractive. And so as a country, I think it's very important that we focus on making sure that we continue to provide educational opportunities, that education is top-notch. The United States remains in the upper third by almost every measure I've seen in the last 10 years. We haven't moved very much. The upper third of other nations with regard to STEM education. Upper third's okay. It's better than the lower third, but it's not where we should be. So I think a national focus on making sure that our folks are actually prepared to go into this work, continuing development of jobs, both through national programs and through commercial development, I think is very important. So we open up opportunities for people to be able to come into that. The same is true for science. We underfund science in this country to an extraordinary extent. That's been noted for the last 20 years since the Augustine rising above the gathering storm. Actually, it's a little bit older than that now. I'm getting older than that. And so I think for quite some time, we've had a lot of indications that we really need to remain focused on this. I do think aerospace and defense continue to inspire. And I think the sooner we get back to the moon and start doing some great things on the moon, the more we'll be pulling people into this industry. But we need to make sure that they have the basis to come and work. Diversity also, forgot to mention that. Also, that's another problem, is that in the last 20, 30 years, the face of the workforce really hasn't changed very much. And people have worked on it very hard in aerospace and defense, and yet it's about the same as it was 40 years ago. Yet we know that a more diverse workforce is actually a more competitive workforce. So this is another issue that it's a tough nut to crack, but it's one that we need to keep on working on.
Yes, I think that's a great question, and I see it a little differently. I see NASA as really one of the marquee government agencies. I just traveled to Europe, and everywhere you go, people are wearing NASA logo T-shirts. NASA is a brand. It's an inspirational brand. And I understand the aging workforce issues. Why I say I see it a little differently from the commercial companies that I represent, companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic, they can't hire enough people. And there's a line out the door for people that want to work for these type of companies, these innovative, cutting-edge companies that are really pushing the envelope in a fantastic way that's really moving the needle for our industries. We also represent universities. There's two universities in Arizona that we represent, Arizona State University, where we'll be having our next board meeting, and U of A out there. And the programs that they're having, the innovative programs and the studies, the space studies programs that they have are fantastic, and they're really preparing these students well to go into the workforce. I caution myself to tread lightly on this next issue, But there is an immigration problem that we have, or maybe a visa problem. We're the most generous country in the world. We educate people from all over the world, and we give them one of the finest educations, some of the advanced educations, doctorates in aerospace engineers. And we're so generous that we give them a diploma, and we also give them a ticket home. Those are the people that we want to be keeping, some of these, the best and the brightest, instead of sending them back to China and India and elsewhere. Let's keep those people. They can help the workforce. And as Mary Lynn said, the diversity of the workforce, I think we're making efforts. I'm not going to turn around and look, but I know that this week there's a program called the Brooke Owens Fellowship Program that gets 36 young women from across the country. Is there anyone? I'll say it. Anyone from the Brooke Owens Fellowship Program behind us? Or alumni? I think there's some here. But they're all coming into town. There are internships all across the country. And I think we're doing a better job of inspiring young women to go into the fields of math and science. We're not there yet, but I think the effort is being made, and I see a lot of the companies that I work with trying to advance that as well.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can I just add, as the chairman of the board of the Space and Rocket Center, that includes Space Camp and Space Academy. So I would like to add that we're kind of a shadow space workforce program down there. We've trained hundreds of thousands of young people, including 11 astronauts, all women, by the way, so far. So that program down there, completely self-funded, is doing a remarkable job of getting young men and women interested in STEM.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the ranking member, Sinema, and it's great to be here to listen and to see my good friend, Mr. Hickam here, Homer. You'd be surprised that West Virginia has a great history of space. We didn't start, but we do have Chuck Yeager, who was quite a wild one, and he's still around. We also had John McBride, who was a commander on the shuttle, and then our mathematician, Katherine Johnson, and then Homer as well. I had the honor of renaming the NASA IV&V Center in Fairmont, West Virginia, in honor of Katherine Johnson. And I've heard some very much concern today about the next generation, but I'm going to tell you, we had about 250 to 300 people there, and by far the greatest majority of them were younger people that were so excited to see. And of course, it's a cross-section of sort of the media and the book, but to recognize her and her great accomplishments at NASA over her lifetime. Roy Lee Cook was there because we weren't able to get you to come, and Roy was waiting for you, but anyway, he's doing well. He's doing well, I'll report. He was another rocket boy. The other thing we learned on the Artemis, and it was quite a lot of discussion about the Artemis project because the administrator was there and did a great job to sort of inform everybody. People don't know about this. This is a problem, I think. Maybe we're not tuned into it, but I had never heard Artemis until I walked into that dedication later in the day. And it talked about the sustainability of the mission and how we're going to have a long-term presence in and around the moon. And I said, of course we are, because it's going to be the first one where the woman is going to go to the moon, and we will sustain it for you guys. So don't worry about that. We also, Yvonne Kegel was there, who's an astronaut, and she was expressing her desire to go to Mars, which to me sounds just so, are you kidding me? Go to Mars? I'm having trouble going back and forth from West Virginia to Washington. And I said, why do you want to go to Mars? Why do you really want to go to Mars? And she goes, I really want to see what effect it has on my body. She's a physician. So she's very curious about the science of what it would have on her own body, and is willing to do this for her, but also for the country and for the advancement of science. In the back of the room, there were robotics teams. There were about 15 of them from high school and middle school. And it was interesting because in the robotics teams, they all had mentors who was either a parent or somebody who did something else and did this in their free time, once a week, twice a week, and during the competitive times, more than that. And I thought, I think about you, Homer, and I think about your book and how the emphasis you had on your teachers in Colwood and everything. And I thought, why aren't we incorporating more of this into the regular curriculum of our schools so that the teachers are there. Mentors are great, but they're volunteer, and it's tough for them. They have another job, they have other family responsibilities. So I would just like to ask you, Homer, if you could talk about the influence of your teacher and your mentors on you in your investment in science, and how you see that now in the context of what we want to do in the future.
Thank you, Senator Capito, for the question. Of course, one of the major elements that I wrote about in Rocket Boys was our teachers, especially one teacher, our Miss Riley, who was our science teacher at Big Creek High School, who so influenced us, who brought us a book that was called Principles of Guided Missile Design when we were trying to figure out how to build rockets. I later saw that book in a PhD program for rocket science. It required a working knowledge of calculus and differential equations, and I personally was having trouble with algebra at the time. But Miss Riley said, all I've done is give you a book, you've got to have the courage to learn what's inside of it. So she and other inspiring teachers right there in Little McDowell County, West Virginia, were pretty amazing, and they raised a generation of coal miners' kids who went out and did some pretty great things, I'd have to say. Not me especially, but we have captains of industry that came out of that era before, of course, the coal industry ran into problems. Now I see, the way I look at it now is, and try to support that, again, is at Space and Rocket Center, Space Camp and Space Academy, Honeywell, and other aerospace, Grumman, other aerospace companies send and pay for teachers to come to Space Camp. And I make a special room on my calendar to go out and talk to those teachers when they come in. And my goodness, they are so enthusiastic about the space program. And the neat thing about a teacher, yeah, we can teach a young person at Space Camp and Space Academy, and they will have all this knowledge. But if you teach a teacher, my goodness, you think of the hundreds and thousands of students that they then are able to pass this knowledge along, and the enthusiasm for the space program. So we must never forget our teachers. God bless them all.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for hosting this hearing today. This is a pretty incredible panel for a kid who grew up on the eastern plains of Colorado and wanted to be an astronaut. I failed miserably at that. But I'll never forget the letters that I wrote to NASA and the pictures I got back from NASA. Mr. Kranz, Dr. Darden, Mr. Hickam, there's a reason people wrote books about you and made movies about you, that you're featured in our culture and our ideas and our society. It's because of the impact you've had on kids like me. Turn around and look at the young people in this room. Please, turn around. Look at them all. Raise your hand if you've been inspired by the work that any one of these have done on the panel. Please raise your hand right now if you want to lead better lives because of the people on this panel. This is what it's about. You didn't just change the 1960s. You changed the world with an impact that will last forever. I mean, Mr. Hickam, all I've done is given you a book. You have to have the courage to find out what's inside it. That comment that your teacher made is so powerful. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the work you've done. And I hope that as we look at things like the Rising Above the Gathering Storm and the American Competes Bill and the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act, the work that we will continue to do to rise above the storm that often is Washington will make every single one of the people that raise their hands in this auditorium, this committee room, proud of the policies this Congress pursues and this country pursues. Because the day that somebody else lands on Mars and not the United States, the day that somebody else invents the next better light bulb, the day that somebody else has created the next better internet, the next better algorithm, is the day that those jobs, those ideas, those teachers, those people go somewhere else. And the power of that innovation, the power of that idea, that thought, is no longer here. We have to maintain that incredible power that is the United States. Not the military prowess, but the power of the people sitting before this committee. What's in your head? the knowledge that you have, that you've given to this country. Thank you for the work that you continue to do to inspire, to dream, to hope, to aspire, to create, because you've made this country a great place. Thanks. That's all I have.
Thank you, Senator Gardner, and thank you for in particular pointing out all the young people here and all of us who are inspired. Dr. Darden, I wanted to ask a follow-up question. As I mentioned in my opening, you and I visited a couple of weeks ago at the dedication of the new street sign in front of the NASA headquarters, Hidden Figures Way. And so now NASA headquarters is on a street named after you and named after your colleagues and fellow pioneers. And as you and I discussed then, I'm particularly inspired because, like you, my mom was a mathematician who became a computer programmer in the 1950s and 1960s, and indeed at the Smithsonian helped work on computing the orbits of Sputnik. And when I went to see the movie Hidden Figures, I took my mom and my wife and both my daughters, and afterwards I was talking with my girls and telling them that Mimi, their grandmother, had been doing much the same as you were doing and your colleagues. And I was commenting to my mom. I asked my mother at the time, I said, all right, how accurate was the movie in terms of what it was like to be a woman and a mathematician in the 1960s, or in her case, starting in the 1950s? And her reaction was she thought it was quite accurate. And I said one of the odder things to me listening to it was seeing people called computers. You know, we think of a computer as a hunk of metal on a desk, not a human being who's computing. And my mother began laughing, and she said when she came out of Rice in 1956 and went to work at Shell, her first job title was computer. And so I would just ask you, Dr. Darden, if you could tell this committee what it was like to be a human computer, to be helping drive the incredible success of NASA all these years.
Well, I think we worked with great people. I would say to you, and it's a confession, I did not like being called a computer. Okay. But the support work that we did, I could program when I went there. Mm-hmm. So the support work that we did with the engineers and everything was very great. I think that what really inspired me is to know what the work that I was doing, the equations I worked with, what they were doing to the real world, right. How they were evaluating the wind tunnels there, such that when we used that data to go fly, everything was correct. And so that really inspired me. And but I worked with wonderful people, and so that's when I went there as a data analyst. Mm-hmm. But soon after, about the time that the Apollo program ended, I began asking to be switched to an engineer. Mm-hmm. And I switched to the engineer at about a year after supersonic flight across the continental United States had been banned by law, and SST program had been canceled. And so that became my life after that. And I mean, I kind of dreamt that and lived with it for 25 years. And still hoping that the airplane that Lockheed Martin builds will be able to have us get rid of that law and we can have a supersonic flight in this country. So it was great. Certainly when Apollo was going up and everything, it was just fantastic to see these things happening in our lives. And my vision for the space in a few years, I guess, is that we can actually start operating in space like we operate the airplanes on Earth. So I actually dream of that kind of mobility within space.
I look forward to that. Mr. Stallmer, in your testimony, you mentioned that, quote, since 2000, investors have supported 375 private space companies with nearly $19 billion in private capital. Like you, I think that is a wonderful development. I think that is key to expanding into space at the level we need to. My question for you, and Dr. Dittmer, feel free to chime in here as well if you have thoughts. What should we be doing to turn that $19 billion, to increase it tenfold and then 100-fold, to get the resources invested that will be needed to go to the moon and build a habitat and go to Mars and go to Europa and explore explore space?
I think it's critical for investors to see that the government is a partner, not an adversary. And I wouldn't say that, any such agency, is deliberately trying to impede what we are doing. But when you have that partnership, that stability of working with, these various government agencies, it provides a sense of assurance, I think, for other investors. There are a lot of investors out there, not just in the U.S., but around the world. And of that $19 billion, over $4.3 billion of that came from last year alone. So 71 unique investors, that have invested in space companies in the last 2 years alone. So there's money out there. They want to see the stability of the government. I think that what the Senate has done with your committee, the bipartisanship of your committee working together, has been a real beacon for many to see. I think the president's enthusiasm on the space program with the creation of the National Space Council, the UAG, which Homer and Mary Lynn and I all serve on, and the passion that reinvigorated passion, I should say, for the space program. I think that's sending a great message to investors and the regulatory environment. And I think this was highlighted in the Space Frontier Act. How do we streamline this regulatory environment to make it more accessible and streamlined to access space? A lot of the rules and regulations that we're under the current regime go back to the 80s, when there wasn't a commercial space industry at all. It was all government space. So how do we adapt to that? And I think your committee has done a fantastic job on trying to address these issues, and I thank you both for that.
Thank you. Dr. Dittmer, did you have?
Yeah, no, I'll just agree with everything that Erica said. I think in my testimony I made some references to essentially how we go forward with government. Government acquisition processes make a lot of sense when you have very long lead time programs that take a long time. They have a heavy R&D component. Using traditional acquisition processes under those circumstances makes sense, although accountability is also very important and should not be lost. But I think also the nation needs to have a conversation with itself about what are the goals with regard to developing an off-Earth economy. I mean, however it is you want to talk about it. Right now, that's sort of been left with NASA, right? Because it's the space agency, but I think there's reasonable questions to be asked when you talk about economic development of low Earth orbit, for example. NASA is not an economic development agency; it's a space agency. So it recently rolled out, not to steal your, because Eric's going to talk about this a little bit tomorrow, but also recently rolled out some commercial development ideas on July the 7th. Does all of that belong in NASA's hands? Should we be talking to the Department of Commerce? Does it make sense to sort of get some other, including NGOs, to sort of look at this? This is really significant. We're talking about doing economic development off the Earth. Let that sink in for a minute. We're not so hot at it down here. It could take 20 years, it could take 20, 30 years, and we don't have the sort of barriers that we have once we're trying to launch. So I think there needs to be a serious conversation, probably in the halls of government, perhaps in Congress and other places, about how do we really go about doing that? And how much investment do we want to make in that? And what kind of investment do we want to start talking about? Government-backed loans? Do we want to, there are lots of means to talk about economic development. How do we go about doing it?
Well, thank you very much, and let me thank each of the witnesses for, I think, very helpful and productive testimony. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your careers and lifetime that has inspired so many young girls and young boys and augurs well for the future. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks, closing on July 23rd. During that time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record, and upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.